welcome to this Schumpeter Lecture organized by Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. My name is Johan Eklund. I'm the Managing Director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and Professor of Economics. Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, we are a research foundation who wish to initiate, conduct, and communicate research within the area of entrepreneurship and economic dynamism in a broad sense. Each year we organize a lecture called the Schumpeter Lecture, and the lecturer invited to this to give this lecture has historically ranged across a wide span of different research areas. And I can mention a few people that have distinguished researchers who have given this lecture before. We have John Haltewanger as the lecturer a few years back, David Odrecht, Philippe Aguillon, William Gartner, Deirdre McCloskey, and Sara Saraswati. These are scholars who in various aspects have contributed to our understanding of entrepreneurship and the role of entrepreneurship in our economies. Today we have the pleasure and privilege to be given a lecture by Professor William Kerr. William Kerr has made significant contributions to our understanding of the economic consequences of migration, and in particular the economic consequences of migration to the US. In his most recent publications, or book publications, where one title is The Gift of Global Talent, How Migration Shaped Business, Economy and Society. And I encourage you, I'm not going to read, of course, Professor Kerr's entire CV, but I encourage you to have a look at his research and his personal homepage. He's active at Harvard Business School. And he's going to, I hope, give us a very interesting lecture here. Together with us, we also have Mats Hammarstedt, who is a professor of economics at Linnaeus University. And for a Swedish audience, Mats' research is, some of us are familiar with his research on migration, the economic consequences of migration in Sweden. Mats has looked into both the economic costs and benefits of migration, but also the impact on self-employment and entrepreneurship. And today we're going to focus on the issue and questions surrounding migration and self-employment and entrepreneurship and the subsequent economic outcomes. I very much look forward to this discussion and the lecture. It's organized in the following way that Professor Kerr has 30-40 minutes, so we're going to listen to him and he's going to give a presentation. Then I'm going to hand over to Mats for comments, but we'll also open up for questions and comments from the participants. But I strongly encourage you to send comments through the chat forum, and I will try towards the end of the lecture capture those questions and comments and recapitulate them in the panel discussion. With those words said, the floor is yours, Professor Kerr, and we're very privileged and happy to have you here. We would, of course, have preferred to have you here in person, but hopefully times will change and you'll have the possibility to actually come and visit us in person. So welcome, Professor Kerr.
Thank you, and I appreciate Johan and Marcus and Mats and the people from the Swedish Entrepreneurial Forum for inviting me to be a part of our session today. I also deeply appreciate the chance to share some ideas and thoughts with you. Let me try to get this screen share to work, which we need to do in our Zoom-based world, and hopefully this looks pretty reasonable on all of your screens as we get underway. So I want to have a chance in a short period that's hopefully not going to be too dry, too academic-y, hopefully has for a broad audience that can include policymakers and practitioners as well as academics, share some thoughts about immigration and entrepreneurship. And I will even be pulling from some of Matt's slides a little bit later to, talk a bit about the Swedish context, but then I want to be able to listen and hear a discussion about how does this apply to Sweden and how do we take these ideas forward. There's a lot of interest in the world of immigration and entrepreneurship right now. Part of that's just due to some increases in the rates of flows of migration. Part of this is due to, as many countries, the United States and Sweden among them, face aging populations and questions a la Johnny Haltingwang about how to restore some business dynamism. These levers that could help increase the rate of business entry are being studied, and immigration is one lever that we can talk about towards that end. And as we also think about being able in a times where the political environment can be highly charged around global linkages, this may be one sort of foothold for us to be able to make meaningful progress and reform for thinking about how to improve our economy. So there's a lot built into this. I want to take the following format. I want to spend just a couple of minutes outlining for the United States some basic facts about immigration. There'll be a helpful kind of background as we get underway. I then want to think a little bit about what are some of the things we've learned about immigration and entrepreneurship in the US. What are some patterns that exist? And what are some of the basic theories that sit behind those patterns? We'll then do a bit more of a deeper dive on one specific topic around the clustering of immigrant entrepreneurs into certain industry spaces. I'm very interested to hear whether this is being replicated in Sweden and how we might investigate that. So it'll be a little bit more closer to the academic space. And then I want to broaden back out towards the end to talk both about policy respect to entrepreneurship and then also the broader picture of global talent flows and end on kind of a little bit more of an expansive note again. So let me first just kind of share with everyone a little bit of the story of immigration to America. And if you ever hear something as simple as saying that there's a lot more immigrant entrepreneurs in America today than there were previously, or a lot more immigration, it is helpful to remember that in my lifetime, so I was born in 1974, if you look at this chart, in the early 1970s, the U.S. immigration was at one of its lowest periods since the turn of the 20th century. And since then, we've had a dramatic increase in immigration to America. It was about 45 million immigrants in the country today, and our share of the population has gotten up to about 15% overall, depending on exactly how you want to count some aspects here. This is not necessarily true for all countries, but we are seeing more migration flows. And if you open up the doors and allow people in, oftentimes for our advanced economies, you're going to be experiencing a lot of inbound immigration here. Now, what are the education levels that we have for the U.S.? This is going to be something that directly sets up a conversation we'll be having around immigrant entrepreneurs. Well, this is a chart that's taken from the Migration Policy Institute and shows that we tend to find immigrants disproportionately represented at the highest and at the lower ends of the education spectrum. So I'll try to, because this could be harder to see in Zoom-based world, point out that the blue line here is the US born adults. And then the purple line is for all immigrants, and the light green line is for those that are more recent arrivals. And if you look down at the lower end, the left-hand side of this chart, you'll see evidence that at lower education levels, those with less than high school degrees, we have disproportionate shares that are foreign-born. If you also go to the right-hand side and you look at those that have a bachelor's degree or higher, you'll see that especially among new arrivals, immigrants are disproportionately represented in those upper education ranges. If you further went out and looked at PhDs or more advanced degrees, you would find that this sort of accentuation increases at higher education. So we often think about the immigration having both a substantial component that's at lower education and skill levels, also a substantial component that operates at the very high skill levels. more broadly, as I want to just share some ideas about the OECD and kind of the advanced nations more broadly when we look at them. This is from work that I did with the World Bank a few years back that looked at migration levels between 1990 and 2010. You might actually be saying, Bill, why don't we do 2020? Well, it takes a while for the World Bank to be able to assemble these types of data. And so we'll have to wait a few more years before the next decennial censuses are all be able to process for this. But I wanted to take a couple of facts about migration more broadly to close off this early sort of setting of the stage. One is, and I'll kind of go from left to right here, this is looking across all of the OECD countries. Those that have a higher skill level, and in this data set it's defined as having at least 1 year of college education or higher, are in 2010 were of equal number to those that were at lower education levels. And that was different than the context in 1990 where the lower education was more. You can next kind of continue to move from left to right here and see that increasingly there's shares that are coming from outside of the OECD countries. And this could be, for example, the rapid rates of migration from China and India into both Euro economies as well as also particularly for the United States. Skipping over here to the one that's to the United States, the U.S. has traditionally received a substantial share. It used to be above half of the inbound migration to OECD countries. That share has now fallen. There are 4 countries, the United States, UK, Canada, and Australia, that at least in 2010 were still accounting for about 75% of the inbound migration flow. So this is not evenly distributed across the countries, but has been accentuated towards more traditionally immigrant receiving countries. And the last thing I want to do is jump all the way out here to this far right-hand side. And I found this to always be something we should dwell a little bit more on. The migration of women is now equal to the migration of men into the OECD countries. And I often kind of stop when I'm talking with policymakers or business leaders, so forth, and kind of ask them to sometimes picture who is the migrant in their minds that they're contemplating, and almost always, a male is the first person to jump into the mind. But I want to challenge to think that the modal person that would be migrating today is a woman, and we need to be thinking about policies and frameworks with that in mind. Turning to the immigrant entrepreneur theme, let me now take that launch point to say, this is a complex world and there's different sides of it. And you see many expressions of both sides. At the far left of the screen is capturing those that are very high skill levels, very sort of dynamic entrepreneurs. You can think of go to the Silicon Valley startup community, and more than half of the founders there are foreign born. The Indus Entrepreneurial Forum is active all around the world, connecting Indian entrepreneurs. And a lot of this also happens through education pathways. So that's a very prominent, particularly for policymakers as well as also for business leaders, kind of side of this landscape. There's also, per the many parts of immigration and the many levels of immigration, there's also an enormous component of this that happens through the mom and pop stores. And I want to, kind of bring that to life today, because that's how a lot of this impact is felt in economies, is not through necessarily creating the next Google, but instead creating the next dry cleaner or manicurist or so forth. And we're going to try to understand some of that evidence that sits around it. Again, to think about how we connect our themes, I began by saying the U.S. context, immigration was skewed towards both the lower education levels and the higher education levels. Interestingly, for entrepreneurs, we also find a lot of that skewness. There's a lot of entrepreneurship that's about self-employment. It's about creating opportunities at lower education levels. It's about opportunities to find jobs. And then there's also a very high-end component to entrepreneurship. We're starting to learn more that the modal entrepreneur is often not the right way to think about stuff. You need to think more about the underlying heterogeneity. And we're seeing both of these lined up in this context. While the U.S. has increased its entrepreneurial share, so about 25% of our entrepreneurs today are foreign born, this is rather unevenly distributed across the economy, or across the country. And I'm going to show you a couple of graphs to kind of bring that to life, and maybe Mats can kind of share the latest understanding about Sweden and whether the patterns that I show you next are going to be replicated. But in the United States, we find that in some states, the migrant share of the entrepreneurial pool is above 40%. California, New York, New Jersey are at the highest end of this distribution, whereas in other states, the migrant share is under 5%. So very uneven distribution across the economy. And that also is not just about a California versus Montana effect. If you look inside California, you can see differences between, for example, where San Jose is and where Sacramento is. Even though they're relatively close by geographically, they can have quite different entrepreneurial shares. To put this in a slightly more kind of informative framework, let me now plot two things side by side. And so on the horizontal axis here, I have the percent of entrepreneurs that are in high-tech firms. And then on the vertical axis, I have the percent of entrepreneurs that are in low-tech firms. And this is a very just stark kind of demarcation here. Everybody's included, but a stark demarcation. And I should have mentioned earlier, these data are from 2012. So if anything, the patterns will, kind of the numbers will be a little bit larger today than they were in 2012, but they're quite representative. And on here, the black kind of entries are the states that we had enough sample size the Census Bureau would let us disclose the results, about 32 states on here. And then we have some of the more prominent cities, metropolitan areas that are on here as well, represented by a triangle and the red text. And I think one of the things that will jump out is that there are some places that are of extreme entrepreneurship by foreign-born. San Jose, aka Silicon Valley, has about 60% of its entrepreneurs being foreign-born. Interestingly, it's also above the low-tech as well as the high-tech. So you see a lot of clustering along this 45-degree line that suggests it's often a broad-based city phenomenon, and you're not typically going to find an instance of a very high-tech cluster for specialized entrepreneurship, and then natives doing a lot of the lower tech self-employment. They tend to be tightly correlated with each other, and you tend to find this predominantly more in major cities. That's the sort of the red kind of being skewed up towards the upper end of the percentage distribution than the lower. Now this is. This, of course, has a couple things in here. This has the entrepreneurial tendency. It also has just the rates of entrepreneurship into these states or into these locations. So let me do one more cut of this early spatial depiction and look at it instead in terms of shares. So I'm going to divide by the underlying immigrant population in each city or in each state, and then again plot on the vertical axis the low-tech distribution, on the horizontal axis the high-tech distribution. A starting point to recognize here is that this point down here where Utah is, roughly, where it's 1 and 1, that's where the immigrant entrepreneur share is exactly equal to the underlying population share of immigrants in the community. And then the numbers that are going out to 2, 3, 4, that's saying that the immigrant entrepreneur share is twice as much, 3 times as much, 4 times as much, and so forth. And what I wanted you to capture here is that certainly a lot of the big city phenomenon is due them to typically having stronger and larger immigration communities overall, and that they're often in the 1 to 2 times kind of range in terms of the immigrant entrepreneur kind of propensity, or what share are they accounting for. And most of the more outlier kind of environments, the Michigans, the Indianas, the Marylands here, that is coming from situations where there's actually relatively less immigrant community overall, but the entrepreneurship component is higher from that. So we are just starting in the US to be able to explore a lot of these types of questions. This kind of data has historically been quite hard to assemble because you either had some census-based data that was about people reporting self-employment, but you couldn't understand as much as you'd like to about the firms that are being generated, or you had lots of administrative data that would be about the entry of new businesses, but you didn't know much about the founding teams and their backgrounds and origins. So we're starting to marry some more of these pieces together. Now, how broadly is this represented? we find that in many countries, there is a higher propensity towards entrepreneurship among immigrants. This next one is colorful. I can't perfectly attest to to its origins or its provenance, but you can. This is I've often worked with ethnic names to be able to think about the backgrounds of people, and these are the most common surnames for Italian company founders, usually at this point, I can just sort of pause for 1 second and keep on going. I can't really gauge the audience reaction here, the smirks or the smiles, but you kind of get the point that there's at least at the distribution of ethnic backgrounds, there's a lot of Chinese and Indian also in the Italian traditional company founder names. And I already had put these slides into my presentation before I learned that Mats was going to be my discussant. So I kept them in there, but I do this with caution. And I just want to share a couple things that I've learned from his work that would connect this as we introduce the Sweden context. And he can keep careful notes and castigate me where I get things a little bit off or wrong here. But this was work from 2014, so roughly the same time frame as the 2012 US results I just showed you, and is looking at, for men in Sweden, the share of self-employment. Natives are down here at the bottom. This is the origin of individuals across locations, and then you can see both their average age and their university distribution. And what I want to highlight from here, what I found to be interesting, is that I see a lot of things that have a similar kind of ingredient mix to some of the stuff that I began by describing. The first is you can see that in some ethnic communities, the self-employment share is higher than the natives. So it's, in the Middle East, it's higher, Eastern Europe and Western Europe and so forth, higher than the native share. These will fluctuate a little bit, but you're capturing some of this community. And second, when I go over and look at the education ranges, there's certainly some communities where the education levels are lower than what you have in the native Swedish population, and some where they're higher. And so there's probably some, again, sort of thought process here as to how is this playing out in our different immigrant communities by their educational backgrounds and distributions. If you go and I'll just, for completeness, show the results for women's self-employment as well coming from this. And again, you can see some of this evidence of both communities that are higher than the natives and some that are lower, and then also a distribution of education levels between those that have less than secondary schooling being pronounced in some forms of the self-employment community, and then those being high. So why immigrant entrepreneurs? And I tried to do a little bit of a run at Sweden, there in Italy, but you could go to the United Kingdom, you go to many environments, and you will see a propensity towards entrepreneurship that we often measure to be higher among immigrants. This doesn't mean that every single immigrant or even immigrant population or country of origin will always be more entrepreneurial than the average, but it does suggest a recurring tendency. I just want to, before I dive into one in particular that we've been exploring, set up some broad themes that we've been, as researchers, exploring as to what could be the cause of this. One of the first ones is, we're beginning to get a better notion of what is an entrepreneurial personality. Now, there are many, many variations of entrepreneurial personality. One of the things we try to disabuse in my MBA course is that there's only one size fits all kind of approach to entrepreneurship. But some of the things that we have learned is that across 4 or 5 different dimensions, entrepreneurs do tend to score extra high. And let me say what they don't tend to score extra high on. You can think of like the big 5 personality traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and so forth. We typically don't, in kind of very careful studies, find systemic differences between entrepreneurs and wage workers on those types of just kind of typical personality traits. Instead, you've got to have something that's a little bit more specialized. Risk tolerance is one. I could talk a little bit more later about some lotteries and experiments that we've run to kind of capture that, but there is a greater tolerance for risk among entrepreneurs. The next 2 are about kind of self-efficacy and kind of having some control over what is happening around me. Am I someone that sort of thinks that the gods or the fates or the governments or whatever is determining my life, or am I someone that believes that I have agency to change things? And then a resilience, and we tend to find entrepreneurs score higher on these types of dimensions. Now, part of that is oftentimes, something that someone was built with, and has even before they become an entrepreneur. Some of these are also reinforced by being an entrepreneur. And I think there's an interesting sort of parallel that we're starting to see some evidence for, but it's not as well documented as what I would hope we can ultimately achieve, which is the act of migration often has some elements of this as well. It can be, a risky endeavor. It can require a lot more kind of locus of control or so, obviously. And so either in the process of just who selects to migrate, or as that migration occurs, how they're able to, how that influences their personality, that may align them with entrepreneurship a little bit more. There's a second very broad-based thing that is true for both lower education, lower skill levels, and higher education, higher skill levels, which is that we see people that are migrating just to get the chance to be an entrepreneur, or the opportunity that comes with that. The world is unfortunately very uneven in the opportunities that it provides to people. And a lot of the migration to the United States, especially at the higher skill levels, is not for American cheeseburgers, but more because this is an enormous product market. There's the venture capital community. There's lots of things that they can accomplish in the United States that they may not be able to in their home country. And so we see that as a prominent piece. And that may again link into those that have a very entrepreneurial tendency. There are other reasons that can be a little bit more discouraging, a little bit darker. There can be weaker just labor market prospects. You could have someone being an entrepreneur when they would prefer to be a wage worker, or be, they would rather not be self-employed. They'd rather have a job with one of the large Swedish companies. Some of this can happen because their credentials are less understood. You can think about the ability of an HR manager to appreciate and understand what a degree from a leading Swedish university means compared to a university that is in Pakistan. They may not be able to appreciate those credentials as well, and that can lead to just weaker prospects than a person's underlying ability, and that can then lead them to want to set out on their own. There can also just be a downright kind of discrimination side of this, that some people have a preference for working with members of their own ethnic group, and that can preclude opportunities. There's a couple other ones here. Sojourner status. There's an increasing understanding, awareness that migration can be temporary. It can be either with the intent to raise some money or provide some funding back into the home, or there may even be this notion of transit migration, of you're using one place as a stepping stone to go to another place. And that may lead someone to be a little bit more self-employed in nature, trying to just take advantage of a quick opportunity and then move on. What I'd like to spend a little bit longer, though, kind of describing or articulating is recent work that we've been doing with about social isolation and kind of these co-ethnic bonds. And this is, it's special for me to be able to describe this in a Swedish form, because all of this work that I'm going to describe next is co-authored with Martin Mandorf, who is at the Swedish Competition Authority. We first met when he was in the United States studying, but this project has been worked on while he's been in Sweden. So what do I mean by this clustering of entrepreneurs? One kind of starting point that I've tried to set up is that entrepreneurs tend to, immigrants tend to be more entrepreneurial. We also find amazing amounts of clustering in certain occupations or categories by immigrant entrepreneurs. My data is all going to be from the United States, but we don't think this is an exclusively US phenomenon. In fact, to the degree that I've been able to look at this in Spain, as well as also in the UK with their data, you see again this entrepreneurial clustering that I'm going to describe. So in the United States context, one example is that for dry cleaners, Koreans are 34 times more likely to own a dry cleaner than other entrepreneurs, either from other immigrant communities or for the natives. Gujarati-speaking Indians are 84 times more likely to operate motels. It's estimated that something between a quarter and a third of all US motels have been operated or owned or operated by Gujarati-speaking Indians. You could go further. Punjabi-speaking Indians are very concentrated in convenience stores. And we see this clustering over and over again. And so let me give a slightly more quantitative view of this. This is a measure that we created that if you have a value of 1 on this scale, it means that your sort of community is distributed across industry spaces for its entrepreneurship, just like the overall population. So you look, just like the broad self-employment sort of background of the United States population. And higher values show a greater clustering. And I'm not now just picking out the one specific case of dry cleaners or motels. I'm going to look at all of the activities of an ethnic group and explore it. And so let me start over with the far right-hand side. You can't see the exact values here, but it's about 1.2, 1.3 for Cuba. So there's a very slight kind of specialization that we're observing for the Cuban community. Canadian, Germany, Poland, Spain, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. So again, these are relatively small amounts. If you take the average ethnic community in the United States, the number is about 8. So they're about 8 times more concentrated in the industry spaces that they're working in than the broadest of communities. And you go further up to kind of our extreme values. And for Nepalese migrants in the United States, there's 40 times the amount of concentration or specialization that we observe. And what Martin and I have been exploring or trying to appreciate is, to what degree do a couple of factors, particularly a smaller community size, as well as also a more kind of socially isolated structure for how that community operates and conducts its activities, how does that maybe lead that community to then want to also specialize in doing entrepreneurship in a specific sector? So not just to be more entrepreneurial, but to do entrepreneurship in the motel sector, like their co-ethnic communities here. And so our sort of specific mechanism is one that is describing that for a number of communities, you have, even after they have migrated, and as a consequence of the migration, there are activities where they are very kind of getting together as the community in terms of family gatherings or religious events or education. And these are settings in which there can be a lot of weak ties that are developed across members of the community. It's also a setting then that if you're someone new to the area and you just migrated to the country and you're trying to learn, how you can get set up in the local business community, you can acquire skills and mentoring through these types of relationships. And we have a lot of reasons to believe that this is reinforcing with self-employed entrepreneurs. If you're a self-employed individual, you've got to be able to think about a lot of different things. You have to think about everything from, where am I getting my supplies from, to what's my pricing strategy, to what are some of the trends that are coming out, or how can I even arrange my store better? And if you can kind of get this sort of virtuous cycle where when we're seeing each other on the weekends, we're able to communicate and talk about these things, it may make all of our businesses more productive and underlying it. We in the paper, we try to build out a little bit more of the real theory behind this, as well as also show some evidence around this. I think I find this to be something that's certainly true for very different communities than the host country. It's also actually true for even among Nordics that are coming to the United States. My wife is from Finland, and one of the things that happens every other Saturday is Suomikoulu. And that's the Finnish school that is, it's 2 miles away from here. And Finns from all around New England come and, share the Finnish traditions there, as well as also have the kids have a Saturday school in the native language that comes from that. So you see a lot of this persistence and evidence, even among European countries and some of the migration happens. This can grow to be quite substantial. So one of the, again, amazing evidences of entrepreneurial clustering is Vietnamese nail care salons in the United States. You have to squint a little bit, but I find the pinwheel on the right just staggering. This is the surnames. Remember, I gave the example from Italy's founders a little bit earlier. This is the surnames of licensed manicurists in Texas. And you know, virtually all Vietnamese names, all the way until you get somewhere over here with Garcia and Smith and a little bit else. Interesting, this all started as Vietnamese refugees came to America. One of the early interactions they had was with an actress in the United States named Tippi Hedren. Tippi wanted to help out this community, came with a lot of ideas about how they, you know, what occupations they could avail themselves of. And the story has it that they became not interested with any of her formal ideas, but became interested with her nails. And from there became fascinated that they wanted to also become manicurists. She then helped them get set up in California with education and training around this. It further blossomed into them spreading across the United States to, again, roughly, it's in the neighborhood of about a third of manicurists nationally in the United States are Vietnamese origin. So there's a strong dynamic element to this that's been growing over time with these communities. And as a final kind of sort of snapshot of this, as we think about industry distributions for self-employment, one of the things that Martin and I have been sort of articulating is that you can see this concentration in a lot of the places that immigrants are specializing in. This is the most complicated of my graphs, so let me take 2 seconds to explain what you're seeing here. What we wanted to look at is, to what degree do immigrants specialize in sectors that are smaller than the biggest sectors in the country? Because this notion of social kind of connection and being able to interact among the community can work best if you have, you know, a smaller ethnic community that's matched up with a smaller industry. You don't need an enormous number of motels in the United States. The Gujarati Indian kind of matches that community very well. So this light blue line starts here and goes up. This is the cumulative distribution of self-employment in the United States for natives. This is the smallest industry for self-employment, which is petroleum. This is the largest industry for self-employment, which is construction. And so I'm just adding people up as we move from the smallest to the largest industries, and this gives the underlying native line. And then these other lines are the distributions of employment of self-employment for immigrants by these different size buckets. And there's 4 groups here basically isolating whether you're the smallest of the communities, the largest of the communities, also how isolated or do we measure you by your in-marriage rates among the community. And the point I want to pull out here is that you can see as you go up here, a bunch of places where, particularly for smaller and more socially isolated groups, you see large jumps up in terms of the immigrant self-employment share. So it's shifted to the left in a way that is favoring these kind of smaller industry spaces. So I find this work very exciting because it gives a much more, you know, it's kind of an early step for a much more nuanced picture as to how immigrant entrepreneurship affects our world. With 25% of US entrepreneurs being foreign-born now, we've got to become much clearer about what are the underlying dynamics of this? How do their businesses look and fare? What's the differences over time? And also think about things in terms of longer term assimilation patterns. If you're a new immigrant to the United States, is it better to join the grocery store or the convenience store or that type of self-employment activity of your community? Or are you better off seeking opportunities with a traditional U.S. company, and how does even things like paying for kids' education sort of factor into it? So we're not at the end of answering all those questions, but I think it's an exciting place for the future. So let me turn to a couple of policy thoughts, and we're going to have more time to talk about this, I think, in the Q&A. I think I'm going to concentrate on policy that is typically pursuing more of the higher education, higher end brackets of work. Very briefly here, a couple things. Let me start at the bottom. There's been a large varieties of countries trying to pursue or introduce policies that are simply trying to go after foreign talent. A lot of countries at the moment are closing their borders or kind of pushing away some of the forms of global integration they've traditionally had. And certainly Canada with the United States has sought to kind of become a welcoming place for that. Particularly to immigrant entrepreneurs, this is a snapshot of one that is from the United Kingdom. It's one of their visa systems. Sweden, as my understanding is, has a similar immigrant entrepreneurial visa category. Interestingly, the United States doesn't. And if you ask me, one policy recommendation I always make for the United States is we really need to have a stronger visa system for those that are wanting to found companies. In other words, we get a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs in spite of our immigration structure, not because of. And as more countries and environments seek to grab a share of the immigrant entrepreneurial community, you'll see more of these visa categories. And then you can get some even more aggressive approaches. Chile has had a program now for about a decade that has sought to bring in foreign entrepreneurs into the country and actually pay them out of public coffers to do that. And they're given office space and they're asked to contribute into the local community by, for example, going and speaking at a high school or doing some meetups. And they're given a little bit of seed capital to help their work. And in Chile's mind, this is in part to try to generate a set of networks, an enthusiasm around linking Chile, which is relatively remote, to all the other clusters and communities around the world. So it goes beyond their underlying base. Another thing that I'd like to just kind of highlight and mention here is, ensuring that these global linkages that are important for entrepreneurship and skill development are realized and activated and pursued. One of the big events in Finland every year is the Slush Forum with immigrant entrepreneurs, as well as native entrepreneurs and so forth, coming together for a very large event, so large that Harvard Business School is now sending a delegation to there. One of the interesting sort of early sparks for the group, the Altos, that then went to help build the Slush community was interaction with Bengt Holmström, who has been in the United States for almost all of his professional career, but certainly worked with the Finnish community, challenged a group of students that had come to MIT seeking his advice about entrepreneurship, and helped unlock and activate that. So think about the first one as being, you can try to set the policy framework and the hardware to encourage and screen better and bring in applicants. There's also a softer side where we should always be trying to activate, engage members of our kind of community and have them be involved in an important and developing process. So I want to spend my final couple minutes just going and painting a broader picture. I very much appreciate and love that we are going to focus on immigrant entrepreneurship, but I would feel we need to set a little bit more of the bigger stage just so that we are complete. As we began big, let's also end a little bit big. Johan was kind enough to mention my book at the beginning. One of the things I do to start the book is just give, for one business week, magazine week, so there's a single week, the various ways that immigrants were showing up in the titles. And I've copied the titles here directly. So the cover story was sadly about immigrant tech communities in Kansas and a murder that happened and some of the politics and backlash that even the skilled immigration that was in that tech community had experienced. There's others about the implosion of Venezuela and a brain sort of drain migration professionals to the United States. Cyprus selling EU passports or citizenship, 25% of their GDP was coming through basically being a stepping stone into the EU. There was something scary for me, Trump slump for US business schools. Foreign students were choosing to go elsewhere because of concern about being able to get visas at the end. And then there was sort of, a high profile CEO case. The point of this being that we're isolating right now one aspect of immigrant entrepreneurs. And I think it's important to kind of set it up in this broader landscape, but there's a lot of other pieces that are coming about. Let me also kind of skip down and show here that these types of communities are significantly changing the way many of our countries operate and can have more global implications as well through product market competition and so forth. Recall my Italian example of the founders. This is just looking at how immigration has transformed U.S. innovation. And if you go back to 1975, about 1 in every 220 patents in America was developed by an Indian or Chinese inventor living in the San Francisco Bay Area. So that would have been enough for a local news story. If you look in 2017, it's 1 out of every 12, and that number is significantly growing. And to kind of just give a sense of what 1 out of every 12 means, if I take the state in America that has the least amount of patenting, add in the second state, third state, fourth state, and so forth, you combine 28 states before you get to 1 out of every 12. And so this is, for me, a big issue going forward. And you can think about a lot of the economic sides of international talent flows and migration and innovation and entrepreneurship. But you also have to think a lot about the underlying dynamics that can happen in countries and communities. And does everyone feel like they're being included and a part of the benefits that are being received? So we have to think a lot more about that going to the future. And as a final sort of closing point, that combines both the United States and Sweden and all of the rest of Northern Europe and Western Europe and North America. What I want to show you here is a projection of by the OECD through 2030 of where will the college graduates be for the G20 countries in the OECD. And many of us have kind of frameworks and thoughts and processes that go back to a world that's around the year 2000. There's 91 million young college graduates, 25 to 30, 40 years old, young college graduates, and most of them are in the OECD countries. When we look ahead to 2030, half of young college graduates will be in India and China. And if you think then about what is the share of Western Europe and North America, we're going to be, according to these projections, 18%. I think that's going to require us to think a lot about global talent flows, our businesses and how they link to opportunities and graduates around the world. This is important for product markets, access to the employees for our future, and so forth. And so there's a lot of conversation, discussion that we need to have towards the future and what those dynamics will look like and play out. So thank you for letting me set up some opening comments, and I will stop my screen share now. And I look forward to first having Matt share a little bit about the Swedish context, and then having a bigger dialogue around this.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very interesting and gives a somewhat different perspective compared to the Swedish situation. Before we head or go over to Mats's comments, there was one question that came in from the audience, which at first hand seems innocent or straightforward, but that is the definition of, what is the definition of an immigrant? Is that straightforward, or is there anything particular to think about? Then I have one quick follow-up question myself. On your slide, I believe it was 17, on the distribution of self-employment. Do we know if it's primarily opportunity-driven or necessity-driven, the self-employment? So just a few quick questions before we hand the floor to Mats.
It's all very, very legitimate questions. And let me supersize your first question. There's a lot more underlying issue about how you define entrepreneurship, as I'm sure the Swedish Entrepreneurial Forum, like in your many, you understand the variations there. And I was using at sometimes various definitions of that, whether it's self-employed or people that have one employee or otherwise. For I think virtually everything that I've done, it is the definition of an immigrant is a foreign-born individual. There are some places where due to the lack of data, you have to try other techniques like ethnic names to try to approximate that. Almost all of the kind of series, at least for the United States, converge to a consistent spot regardless of those routes. So we might be concerned in some settings that could lead to very skewed perspectives. That's bringing something similar. To your question about the industry distributions and is this opportunity or not, the best evidence suggests that for us, it is an opportunity-based migration. And the way we would look at that is through wages. And we see that the communities are being able to achieve greater wages than what would be predicted based upon the individual's underlying traits, and kind of capturing something around that. That does not mean that there's never any sort of partial, negative side or discrimination or something that maybe gets something going. If I go back to the original example of Vietnamese nail care salons, they were precluded from most every job at that point. So at that point, it was at its foundation, they were refugees, and it was not going to be opportunity based in general. But a lot of the subsequent activity would be very entrepreneurial based or opportunity based as they get kind of the strength of that community around that particular place.
Okay, thank you very much. So without further ado, Mats, the floor is yours. Look forward to your comments and your perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this lecture and to comment on this very interesting presentation from Bill. I will give you a brief presentation about the situation in Sweden and see how it looks and if there are similarities and differences compared to what William presented. It will be a quite short presentation and maybe we can have a discussion after that. So we'll start here to give you an overview of migration to and from Sweden during the last decades. You see that there has been a quite large immigration to Sweden during the last decades, and this migration has shifted from labor force migration up till the mid 1970s here, and after that migration consisted mostly of refugees and tide movers, and this migration increased very much here during the last 10 years, peaking around 2015 and 2016, which what is known here in Sweden as sort of refugee crisis, with a lot of immigrants coming from countries in the Middle East. And during the last decades, the migration has also shifted from not only from labor force migration to refugee migration, but the composition has also changed. Today, immigrants consist mainly of people coming from countries outside Europe. So there's also been a change in the composition of the immigrant population living in Sweden. You can see here today that in 1970, around 60% of the immigrant population was born in the Nordic countries, and in today this only slightly about 10%. But on the other hand, the non-European share has increased from around 5% in 1970 to more than over 50% today. So there's been a very large increase in immigration, but also a shift in the composition of the population during the years. So, and what's interesting here is that we have problems in integrating immigrants on the Swedish labor market. This is highlighted here by the employment and the unemployment rates for these groups. You can see that the immigration problems is highly concentrated to the people coming from countries outside Europe, from Africa and from the Middle East. These are employment rates and unemployment rates for people in the age span 15 to 74 years of age. To see that for people coming from born in Sweden and from people born in European countries, the unemployment rate is around 5%, both for males and somewhat higher for females from Europe. Returning to those countries outside Europe, it is considerably higher, and around between 20 and 25% are unemployed among people coming from Africa and Asia, and it's even higher for females from these regions. So, and another thing to highlight the situation is to look at the educational attainment among these groups that has arrived during recent years. You can see that here, most people during recent years have come from countries in the Middle East. So if we look at the educational attainment here among people born in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Syria, you see that there is a large share of people with short education here, 9-year compulsory school or shorter education. Compared to natives who are only 10% without education and attainment, this share is over 52% among people from Somalia and around 35% of people from Syria. And it's also a quite low share of individuals who have high education, a university education. You see that among native Swedes, around 1/4 of them have a university education, while the share is much lower for this group. Here I can say that these figures are based upon individuals who are 25 years of age or older. So there are large integration problems in the sense that unemployment is high, employment rate is low, and it's also a problem here since a large share of the individuals have quite short education among those who have arrived during recent years. So let's then turn to self-employment. These figures presents the share of self-employed. It differs a bit from the figures that Bill presented, and that is because we are studying, here we are focusing on only private firms, and there is also calculated from a different age span. But it doesn't matter because I only use them to show that certain groups of migrants are overrepresented in self-employment compared to natives. And those groups, most self-employed in Sweden, are people that origins from countries in the Middle East, such as Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They are overrepresented. Here, as I said, we have only those active in private firms. The share will be somewhat higher if we look at those active in limited liability companies as well. So, and the trend has been increasing. So from the 1990s and ahead, the share of immigrants who are active as self-employed or as active as entrepreneurs in Sweden has increased substantially among certain groups of immigrants. And also there is a high share of self-employed females. The share of self-employed females among immigrants has increased during the last decades as well. So turning then to the same background factors as Bill discussed, why do immigrants become self-employed? Well, we can discuss this from different theories. One different certain theory could be disadvantages on the labor market, such as discrimination. And you can see that when we test these theories, you see that we get evidence from this in Sweden. People with disadvantages on the labor market, they are found to be overrepresented in self-employment. So there's definitely sort of a push factor here that makes people from certain regions with differences in entering the labor market to prefer self-employment. And I can also add here that certain groups of immigrants, those coming from countries outside Europe, they have higher self-employment rates in many cases, but they have also higher exit rates from self-employment. So they are not only become self-employed, they have also a higher, they also run a higher risk of exiting their self-employment activities. Another factor that has been studied is that traditions from the home country may play a role here. Yes, and you find evidence from this in Sweden. People from countries with a large self-employment sector, they are overrepresented in self-employment in Sweden as well. So there's been evidence from this theory. Third factor might be the existence of ethnic enclaves and networks. And here we can state that both positive and negative effects, as we found, this effects has varied over time. There is a variation over time, and also dependent on how you define, so to say, these ethnic enclaves. I think there's a large difference here between Sweden and the US, because those areas where many people with immigrant background resides in Sweden, they are, so to say, heterogeneous in the sense that there are people coming from many countries living together. So they are not, so to say, homogeneous ethnic enclaves in Sweden in the same sense as in the US, people with the same ethnic background lives together. But here, the immigrant dense areas, they are more heterogeneous, and the effects of these enclaves on the self-employment propensity for migrants, they are mixed. But we also found strong intergenerational links in the sense that immigrants who are self-employed, they so to say affect the next generation in their self-employment activities. So the propensity to become self-employed among the next generation is quite strong among immigrants in Sweden. So there are different reasons here for why immigrants choose self-employment, and there is certainly a strong evidence for the fact that people with disadvantages on the labor market, immigrants with disadvantages on the labor market, they prefer self-employment in Sweden. They choose self-employment. Now let me dig a bit further, take a closer look at two questions here from kind of recent work in Sweden, which we have done here. First question then is, we can discuss, do self-employed immigrants create job for others than themselves? We shall have a look at that. And then also, do self-employed immigrants experience other problems in their firms than self-employed natives? So we can have a closer look at just these two questions. First, if you start to look at this self-employed who have employees, are they more likely to have employees than self-employed natives? Now, let me say that this study here is focusing on the private firms, and which is one group of self-employed. We look at people with private firms, and we can see here among self-employed males with natives and with different groups here, immigrants, Middle East, and from other Asian countries and from Africa. You see that the share with an employee, at least one employee, is much higher among those migrant groups. So among those originating from the Middle East, 47% of those who are self-employed males with a self-employed males with a private firm have at least one employee. Corresponding amount for natives is 13%. And then among those who have an employee, how large is the share that have at least one employee with a non-European background? Well, in this case, this share is around 60% for people originating from the Middle East or Asian countries, and around 50% for those originating from Africa, while it's less than 6% for those originating from Sweden. And then having a recently arrived non-European employee, that means an individual who has arrived from a non-European country during the last 5 years. And also here, the share is much higher among those who are self-employed with a firm background. So what you can say here that self-employed migrants, they create jobs for themselves, but they do also create jobs for other immigrants and might therefore play an important role in the integration process of those recently arrived immigrants. Figures is around the same for females, and we have more figures on that in the paper, which shows that female immigrants, self-employed, they employ other females. So there are many dimensions of this, and many dimensions that shows that self-employed migrants, they create jobs, not only for themselves, but also for others. They employ other recently arrived migrants, and females employs females, and so to say, and thereby they play an important role in the integration process. So that's one way to look at this. Another way we can look at is problems experienced here by self-employed immigrants and natives. You know, as I said earlier, immigrants from non-European countries, they not only have high self-employment rates, they also have higher exit rates from self-employment. And here we are looking at self-employed immigrants who are active in the service sector, and because the large share of non-European self-employed are active in that sector, and see in a survey how large shares stated that they're facing certain types of problems here. Well, look at different types of problems here: access to financial capital, laws and regulations, payroll taxes, access to workers, and also perceived discrimination by customers, suppliers, and banks. And you can see here that comparing natives with those from non-European countries, you see that the problems that they they experience, those who are originating from non-European countries, they are higher than among natives and also among those who come from European countries. You see that around 13% of the non-European self-employed, they perceive that they experience discriminations from customers, could be compared to 2% among those from Sweden. And also there is a high share that perceive discrimination by banks, around 20%, which is twice as high as the share originating from Sweden here. So another dimension of this self-employment, immigrant self-employment, is that people who are, originate from countries outside Europe, they experience other types of problems and obstacles in their self-employment activities. And we also know, I don't have any figures about that here, that people from these regions, they pay higher interest rates on their bank loans than natives do. So there are different problems here. So I should sum up this the situation in Sweden here by saying that self-employment among immigrants in Sweden has increased markedly since the 1990s, and high rates of self-employment are found among especially non-European immigrants, those who have problems in entering the labor market. And we also know that self-employed immigrants, they create jobs not only for themselves but also for other immigrants, and female self-employed, they create jobs for other females, and they therefore they may play an important role in the integration process. But self-employed migrants, they are facing other problems than self-employed natives, and they are pushed in, but they have also higher exit rates. So, and I also can say here to conclude that there are large immigration problems and challenges with integrating immigrants on the labor market, and several measures might be needed to solve this situation. I think that self-employment is only one of them. Only self-employment is not enough in solving Sweden's integration problems, but it might be a usual measure in some cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. Let's see if we can remove your slides. Thank you very much, Mats. I realize we only have a few more minutes, and we have a couple of quick questions from the audience, and these are to some extent very controversial issues that we might get into when we get into policy implications. And from that perspective, I think perhaps we could get the opportunity to arrange more of these webinars and hopefully meet in person at some point. I can only accentuate what Mats has been saying here on the problems of integration in Sweden, that if you look at income measures, the situation deteriorates quite significantly, and we have a very large group of foreign-born who are not self-sufficient. So with that said, I would like to hear from both of you a few words on policy implications. You, William, you mentioned the visa situation on highly skilled labor in the US, but there are, as we're talking about a very heterogeneous group, I assume that we need a very heterogeneous policy response. And there are certainly the case that we have the issue of highly skilled migration, but we also have the situation where migrants lack skills to, particularly getting established in perhaps the Swedish labor market. So I would like to hear your reflections on appropriate policy responses. And then we have two specific questions from the floor. One for you, Mats, and one for you, Bill. For Bill, there is a question from the audience in terms of how much employment opportunities are created by migrant entrepreneurs, if you could elaborate on that. And for you, Mats, there is a question on discrimination versus skills. and to what extent discrimination and what extent skills explain the employment gap that we observe in the Swedish labor market. Bill, would you like to begin?
I'm happy to begin, and thank you for Mats for that wonderful discussion and for sharing kind of the differences and similarities between Sweden and the United States and elsewhere. And I highly agree with every kind of policy and business perspective that says we need to be customized and think about application into each environment. To pick up a couple of themes and then end up where Johan is hoping that I will guide this in terms of a policy discussion. Let me highlight one thing that I wanted to kind of connect back to Matt's presentation, which is from a business and also policy side, recognizing that there is differences between residential segregation and then also kind of occupational community kind of cohesion. You can't become 25% of nail care salons with the ethnic enclave. And so trying to appreciate the different policies and approaches and settings for places in terms of what is the underlying social fabric and connectivity, and then also what is the residential kind of makeup and context there. In terms of the employment creation, I think we had a lot of similarities in the US between what we're observing and what is present in Sweden. Usually the immigrant founded companies in the United States tend to start a little bit smaller in terms of employment size, but then they're growing faster. And after a few years' time, we don't see much in terms of different employee characteristics at a net count. We do see, very similar to Sweden, that there's a greater degree of co-ethnic hiring. So people among the immigrant community and how they pick up. I don't know whether this is true for Sweden, but I think the interesting kind of follow-on to that is that if I was to take one particular country, and let me just pull out Haiti here, they're more likely to hire Haitians into employment roles. But then next on that list, in terms of proclivity, is not other ethnic community, other immigrants in the United States. It's U.S. natives, and so there is a particular bent towards members of the community. But then the employment becomes actually more broad-based that it follows. That may or may not be true for Sweden. To go to policy, it's challenging in particular landscape for immigrant entrepreneurs to define what an intervention will look like. And I would actually start with maybe 2 or 3 other kind of things to make sure that are correctly set as what I would lead with the policymaker with. One, in terms of being able to engage in entrepreneurship, broadly speaking, we talk a lot about lowering the barriers to be able to found a business, and also being able to have people, if they experience a disruption or failure, not get thrown out of their lives, but be able to recover and build from that. So I want to start with what is the cost of entrepreneurship in a setting and how can you engage in that? In terms of assimilation and integration, one of the challenges we face in the United States is not only about immigrant assimilation, which we have that struggle, especially for those that are coming from very low education backgrounds and skill sets, but we also have that same challenge and problem for U.S. natives. It's become ever harder to move from the lower ends of the economic distribution to upper ends, or have upward mobility. And so an encouraging kind of point, or what I try to push it, is things that you can do to encourage economic mobility across the population will typically be very helpful also for the immigrant assimilations and communities. It's a challenge because one thing that we have to experience in the United States, there was a high profile book recently written about this, is from the perspective of a first generation immigrant to the country, anything may be better than what got left behind. But if you're talking then about the sons and daughters, they may sort of not be as happy with that kind of improvement that was made because they grew up in that environment, and they're wanting to be able to move up the ladder and pyramid and have great opportunities. And that's where our country needs to make sure that it facilitates that. The last thing I'll say, and this just leads back over to Mats's comments, is that with the large refugee population, you have to think a lot about what labor opportunities are being provided. And there's been a substantial amount of literature for both Sweden and also other countries about what are best practices for allowing people to get into the labor market. And the more that you can facilitate that, the greater the overall economic assimilation.
Thank you, Bill. To be respectful of the participants' time, we're already running on overtime. We've been talking now for 1 hour and 15 minutes. But Mats, would you like to answer the question or wrap up the discussion?
Well, you see, the situation that I presented here with a large share of unemployed people and low rates of employed people. Research has shown that this is explained by a number of factors. The educational attainment among the groups, the language skills, the access to networks and social networks, and also to discrimination. But to quantify how much is explained by skills and how much explained by discrimination, that's not that easy. But I'm all convinced about the fact that with this large share and this increased share of people with low educational attainment, it's of certain interest to increase the skill level in that population in order to improve the standing on the labor market. So skills plays an important role here. I'm absolutely convinced about that. Thank you.
So thank you both, and thank you for everyone participating. I would personally prefer to keep on going with this conversation for the rest of the afternoon. And I'm absolutely confident that we will revisit these questions. And Bill, hopefully you can join us again for future discussions. And I sincerely hope we can meet up in person here in Stockholm. And the same goes for Mats. I hope to see you here in Stockholm at participate in such future events. I realize that we have a number of questions from the audience. I will compile those and keep them, and we'll hopefully come back and talk more about this in the future. I would like to give a warm hand of applause in usual case now, and it will be silly if I start applauding here. So I'll end by saying thank you very much for participating today, and let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.